and you are tuned into the Nick and Joe show for Sunday, May the 21st, Memorial Day in the United States. Actually, tomorrow's Memorial Day in the United States, and tomorrow's Victoria Day here in Canada. I keep getting them mixed up because
Yeah.
it's kind of like Easter, right? It's Easter Sunday, it's Easter Monday. I don't even know what the significance of Easter Monday is, other than, you got an extra day off. Unless you're in the federal public service, in which case, well, you do get an extra day off. Everybody else gets a long weekend. You get a double long weekend.
Yeah,
So
I think
it's
that's
like
the
it's
excuse.
in the province of Quebec. In the province of Quebec, I believe it's Easter Monday is the holiday, and Good Friday is the still a work day. But in Ontario,
The other
it's
way
the
around.
opposite. Good Friday, everything is closed. Easter Monday is a regular work day. So, of course, unless you're working for the government, in which case you get both of those days off.
Yes, yes, and it's funny because when you think about it, I've always said, or have said for a while now, we have too many holidays. Every time you turn around, there's another holiday, and I'm serious. And this goes back to my truck driving days. Like if you were in the States uh, over the July 1st, 4th weekend, it was a week before you were shut down. You were shut down in October for Thanksgiving in Canada. You were shut down in November for Thanksgiving and now and they always plan it so it's a long weekend, right? So you're shut
Right.
down Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. It's Monday before that's 4 days. When you're driving a truck or you're count on, you can only get paid when you deliver something, then that's a big hole in your calendar. And it's not just once. You scatter that across the year, that's a lot of days.
Right.
So, you know, I I'm not against holidays per se, but I think you can overdo anything. And I think we've kind of reached that point.
Well, it works out to. I think that the idea is to try to have one long weekend,
That
roughly
extends from
one long
January 1st.
weekend every month. So
I
it,
thought,
it so you get in January. Well, obviously you've got the Christmas and New Year's. You've got New Year's in February. Now in Ontario, we have Family Day. In
we used to
March,
get that
what
every
do we
week.
have in March? I don't think we have anything in March, do we?
St. Patrick's Day.
But St. Patrick's Day isn't a holiday.
Well, don't give me any ideas or it will be.
No, 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 of course not. But in April you
Although
have
I can live with that.
Easter. In May you
Yeah.
have Victoria Day.
Yeah.
In June, there's nothing in June, but you have the July 1st weekend, which is June, July. Then there's a
Right.
long weekend, used to be called the bank holiday in August. Then you have Labor
Right.
Day in September, Thanksgiving, at least here in Canada, in October. And then there's nothing in November. And then, of course, there's Christmas in December. So it's almost every month there's a long week. There's one long weekend almost every month. So it works out to something like 10 long weekends a year. And of course, as I said, with Easter, it's a double long weekend if you work,
And
depending on where you're working.
it's
So,
it's funny. Look, I understand there's working hard doesn't necessarily mean, I mean, when you do this, you are working hard, but taking a spade and digging a ditch. Okay. I get that. Not everybody's blue collar out there sweating in the heat of the sun and would fit the traditional role of working hard. Working hard today can mean, working in office. There's all the stress that comes with interoffice politics and, trying to get ahead in life that can be working hard too. So I'm not trying to say that the only people who ever work hard are farmers or truckers or guys in the oil rigs. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that we in general have forgotten what working hard means. That it meant there used to be a time when it was a 6 day work week, and you worked if you were able to you worked like 8-10 hours a day. and you had Sunday off, and that was it. You'd work. A lot of people would work 5.5 days, halfway, and some still do. They work till noon on Saturday. Some places now it's 24/7. They just roll. But in general, I think when you think about the psyche, the kind of mentality it takes to maintain that over the long haul, we don't have the mental calluses we used to. We just
I
don't.
agree with that.
And I don't know why that is, but it's just true.
Okay.
So that's my attitude on that.
And Nick's, by the way, for those of you who aren't aware of this, Nick is coming to us from the main cabin in the, what's the name of the ship again?
The MV Summer Song.
Summer Song, MV or MB?
Yes. Motor Vessel Summer Song.
Okay, Summer Song, got that.
Now, directly over my head, I'm going to show you this because I can. I have the technology. You see that up there? You know what that is?
Of course, I know what that
Now,
is. It's the
I knew you would.
it's the Royal
Canadian Navy anthem.
It's the Royal Navy flag.
Well, yeah, we flew it too.
Okay.
Well, but I can't fly it. Because we don't have.
You know what we missed a couple of weeks ago, Nick, and it was actually we did the show.
Battle of the Atlantic.
Yeah, Battle of the Atlantic Sunday.
How do we miss that?
I don't know. I thought exactly the question I asked myself afterwards. I go, how could we miss that? How could we forget about that?
Between the two of us, one of us should have thought of it.
Too much talk about all kinds of other things going on in the world, and not just in the world, but domestically as well. Which is a good way to segue into, one of the topics that we wanted to talk about tonight, and you wanted to talk about particularly, Nick, was the whole area of drug policy in this country, and the I don't know what the right term to use is, the disintegration, I think, almost of the barriers of the bulkheads that we had against the proliferation of dangerous drugs. And I've been following the situation in British Columbia quite closely because, as you probably know, as of January 1st, the British Columbia government is no longer charging and prosecuting people who are found to be in possession of dangerous drugs of any kind. So you could have cocaine, you could have heroin, you could have crystal meth, you could have any of these drugs, but as long as they're for your personal use, then you will not be criminally prosecuted. Now, there are some limitations on that. For instance, you can only have a certain limit, a certain amount of drugs on your possession. They have to be for personal use, number two. And number three, there are age restrictions as well. And the danger of this, there are a couple of things, Nick, about that particular policy that are very troubling. The first is, I'm very upset. I'm terribly upset by the fact that people who are against that policy are still pointing their fingers at the BC government. And the BC government, of course, has some culpability here because they're the ones that asked for the exemption. But it's really important to understand that it is an exemption. It's a criminal code exemption. And so the federal government, the Trudeau government, had to sign off on this. So this is not a BC government policy as much as it's a Trudeau government policy as it applies to British Columbia. Granted, the BC government asked for it, but the Trudeau government was under no obligation to give it. And why this is so troubling is, first, because it's really important that the people who are the decision makers who implement these kinds of policies own their decisions. That's the first thing. But the second thing is that is not widely known, and that is that the city of Toronto has applied for the same type of exemption. They applied for it at the same time that the BC government applied for it. Now, they haven't been given it yet. And here's the interesting thing. Just a couple of months ago, the city of Toronto amended their application to remove any restrictions. So if the federal government gives the city of Toronto the same waiver with respect to criminal prosecution on drug offenses for personal use. But in the case of Toronto, they want to remove age restrictions. They want to remove quantity restrictions, and those are the two very big things that make the BC policy even a little bit tolerable. So, in other words, if the government in Toronto gets its way, it won't matter how old or how young you are. And the other thing is that you won't have the same kind of limitations on how much of these dangerous drugs that you can have in your possession, as long as it's in your possession, it's for personal use. So, I suppose, if you get caught with, 10 pounds of heroin or not heroin, but cocaine, that as long as you're saying it's for personal use, I just wanted to have a lifetime supply. Uh, I suppose that would now be a defense if indeed the federal government grants the exception, which they haven't yet. And I've been trying to get people in Toronto, because they're going through an election campaign now for mayor to replace John Tory, who had to resign, as you know. And for the life of me, I just can't get voters in Toronto, particularly pro-family, pro-life, small c conservative voters, to get engaged and to make their voices heard on this issue, which is really frustrating, and it's really tragic, because this is the time in a municipal election, because so few people actually vote, where you can actually have a real impact. You're not going to be lost on this. If we could just get that community engaged in Toronto on this issue, they could have a significant impact, but they won't.
Yeah, it's really frustrating, and I want to bring in a conversation I had with a gentleman from Holland while we were out and about this weekend. We decided Memorial Day weekend would be a good weekend to kind of get out, and because we're not quite ready, we won't be. We're going to be taking the boat out of the harbor this week, but we weren't quite ready for that. So we said, let's get out of town. Let's go camping. So we did. And on the way back from a place called Tofino, which is up on the west coast of the island, about halfway up, we ran into a couple who had pulled over to look at one of these panoramic vista views that you think only comes on postcards about a fantasy art like Lord of the Rings or something. It's just stunning. They had pulled over, and we pulled over behind them because Allison wanted pictures. She's always taking pictures. And, good. I'm glad she does, because I'm not a big picture taker. But anyway, we got talking to them and found out they were Dutch. They were from Holland. And, we talked about scenery, geographical differences. And I talked to them for probably about a half an hour. Very likable people, very nice people. But we got talking about, couldn't help it. Sooner or later, politics came up. I don't know who brought it up. But anyway, I said, we got talking about the drug problem. They were talking, they'd been to Vancouver and saw some of the carnage downtown, and they just couldn't get over it. And they said, we went through this in the 1980s. And I don't know if you ever went to Amsterdam, but I did in the 1980s. I was there 84, I think. And walking around, you could get anything you wanted. From the time we left the dockyard until the time we got back, there were people offering us, you name the drug of the day, it was available. Anyway, they said they tried that policy and it failed miserably. So they quit it. They canceled it because it wasn't working. And they're talking about the same thing that what we're doing here now. Well, there's something called OPE, other people's experiences. Learning from them is a good idea. When you look at what the Dutch tried back in Holland during the 1980s and how miserably that failed, don't think that they didn't do it right, and the way that you're going to do it's going to work better. Think the policy fails, and we're not going to do that here. That's the correct line of thinking, but that's not the way it's being laid out. And they were just blown away that we would even think along that line. They had a hell of a time with it. The gentleman I was talking to worked for the city of Amsterdam, and a municipal employee. And he said, it's just insane what's going on in Europe right now in a lot of different fields. One is nobody can talk about anything. You cannot talk about anything. It's all very, very surface stuff like the weather and, maybe the local soccer game, but you cannot have any kind of intelligent, in depth conversation for fear of offending somebody. And boy, does that sound familiar. So there's a lot of parallels between the two places. And I just, when he was talking about the drug issue, like that, when you brought it up just now, there's a lot we could learn if we only had the brains to look at what other people have done and make sure we don't make the same mistakes. That's what it's history. That's what we're supposed to do with it, is learn from it. And we've fallen down miserably on it.
Well, I don't even have to look at the experience of other places where they've tried this to see the terrible illogic involved in the reasoning behind it, the rationale behind it. The idea being that somehow or other, and this is, I'm not making this up, part of the justification for asking for the exemption from the federal government surrounds the idea that, or the belief, the notion that because it's a criminal offense, that we're discouraging people from getting treatment when they want to get treatment. I mean, that is an actual argument, and it's shocking how much weight that argument has in government circles. And so
Did you
people are
happen?
presenting this as a means of encouraging people who are addicts to get treatment. We want to help them to get treatment. And of course, we want them to get treatment, okay? We don't want people running around addicted. But I've on my show, Nick, and elsewhere when I've done interviews and discussed this, I keep on asking the same question. And I'm still waiting for somebody to come forward with an answer to the question. And it's this: name me just one instance in all of British Columbia where somebody came to a doctor or a treatment facility, an intake desk at a treatment facility, or a social worker, or their family doctor, or a hospital, any scenario where somebody's come to whoever they're seeing and says, I'm addicted to whatever it is, I need treatment, help me to get treatment. I keep asking this question. Name me one instance anywhere where whoever was the recipient of that question, of that request for treatment, picked up the phone, called the police, and said, I have an addict here. Send somebody right away to arrest them because it's a crime. It never
Yeah, that doesn't happen.
it never happens. It's never happened. It's never going to happen. So the argument that the fact that mere possession, is a criminal offense is in no way, shape, or a barrier to getting treatment. It's a
Let me
false
ask you something.
flag. It's a whatever you want to call it, red herring, straw man, whatever you want to call it.
Well,
It,
it's
it
just flat not
it's
true.
it's flat, and but what shocks me the most about this is how ready people are willing to buy into it. Now, I've said this before. I understand there is a criminal record issue. And
Yes.
that is to say that if you happen to have a criminal record for mere possession,
Yep.
that record's going to follow you around for the rest of your life.
That's right.
And so if you were an addict as a young man or a young woman, but you managed to get yourself cleaned up, you became sober, you got your life together, you become a great productive member of the community, but you can't get a job because you have a criminal record. That's a fair issue, and my argument is, if you want to deal with that issue, we can find ways to deal with that issue. I'm
Yeah,
not
exactly.
arguing that we have to in every case have a criminal conviction. I'm not arguing that. I'm arguing that removing the criminal aspect of it at the front end for so many reasons, okay, doesn't the argument that they're making in favor of it is not logical on its face. It doesn't compute. It doesn't add up.
Okay, let me jump in here because, and I don't know if you're able to do this or not. If you've got it, great. If not, that's okay. But to demonstrate the kind of thinking that goes into this program, because you're right, this is a federal issue, uh, and the Liberals can jump up and down all they want about it. They're the government of the day, and they're the one who sign off on these exemptions. Now, the Minister of Health, Mental Health, and Pierre Poilievre got involved in a short but rather, I'll call it passionate exchange. Were you able to download that clip?
Unfortunately, I haven't yet. I'll look for it during the break.
Okay, because we should show that, because the Liberal the mental health, the Minister for Mental Health has a meltdown in the House of Commons, and because Pierre Poilievre makes a very good point, and she just can't deal with it. She doesn't want to deal with it, because if she deals with it accurately, it's going to make the Liberals look really badly. So she doesn't want that. So she goes into this tirade, and I think people need to understand that to what lengths people who support this brainless program and this mental attitude about how to help people, because the answer is treatment. I've been saying this for as long as I've been in media. I remember back in the days when I was in terrestrial radio, when I had Chris and Lisa Grinham on with Safer Ottawa, walking around picking up dirty needles in the Byward Market in downtown Ottawa. I went with them. We were picking up needles right beside the radio station in the heart of the Byward Market. Okay, so I'm well aware and well versed in this particular topic. It was, at the time, it was almost like there was an industry. We called it the victim industry. If you solve the problem, there's a lot of people who are going to go have to find jobs that don't have six figures attached to them. So they don't really want to solve the problem. They want to make it look like they're solving the problem or trying, and that they're going to hang on to their jobs. It's like if you have a group that's all about a particular group's rights, and they achieve those rights, right? They win, let's say, the women's right to vote. Okay, so what the feminists do when they win the right to vote, if that was their whole mantra leading up to winning the right to vote, they either dissolve the organization because they accomplished their goal, or they find something else. And the more often they do that, the more radical the things they find become. And that's why these groups never go away. It's the same. So that I see the same kind of seeds of that mentality in these different groups. And I'm not consigning conspiracy theories or anything like that. I'm just looking at what, if it walks like a duck and it looks like a duck and it sounds like a duck, it's probably going to taste like a duck.
Except the quote is that if it walks like a duck and it quacks like a duck in politics, it's a horse.
Yeah, that's right. I know.
But I listen. I'm making a joke. I hear what you're saying, Nick. It's a serious problem, and I think it's important to be fair. You know, because I'm a very big believer in being skeptical when it comes to the use of statistics to prove a point. And by the way, I should point out that the government of BC, the BC coroner's office, this past week released a report that showed that there's been a sharp increase in the number of drug related deaths since January 1st. And just to give an example, in the month of April alone, we saw a 17% increase over last April in the number of deaths. And that's deaths. That's not overdoses and other illnesses or health problems associated with this. So I'm reluctant to point at those statistics and say that this is absolute proof that the policy has done nothing but increase either increase the drug use or increase the number of people who are coming to British Columbia because of their lax drug laws. Because the weather in British Columbia in the wintertime is much nicer than the weather in Toronto. So let's face facts. If I'm going to go somewhere and live on the street, it's going to be in Toronto, British Columbia, not Toronto.
Vancouver.
So there are lots of factors to
Yeah.
go into it, which is why I'm reluctant. But it's pretty hard to just turn a blind eye to those numbers. But here's the other thing that I noticed. Okay, in the news reports around that increase, in the number of people that were being negatively affected by drug use, I noticed the introduction of a term that I had not heard before in this debate, and that term
What's
is
that?
regulated toxic substances. In other words, they didn't say opioid
Woo!
crisis, they didn't say fentanyl. What they said was the problem is we see all of these deaths, a sharp increase in the number of deaths as a result of use of unregulated toxic substances. And the minute I saw that, this alarm bell went off. Okay. The flashing lights, Nick, the red flags flying unfurled. Okay. Because that is an indication to me that the next step is going to be to say the problem here is that the drugs that people are getting on the street are not safe. And
They're already
that's
saying.
true as far as it goes, but the
Right.
solution that's going to be proposed is let's start legalizing and regulating the production of these drugs so that people are not dying because they're getting something that's laced with something else or whatever.
Well, aren't they already doing that? Don't drug companies make
Well,
heroin?
they're
Don't they make
they're doing it.
fentanyl? Don't they make all these drugs?
Well, they do in small quantities, but not for commercial use. And I could
Oh, I
see
see.
I
So,
could see where we're going with this. The direction we're going is I could almost see BC being a test case in support of a policy of what they did with marijuana. Decriminalize
you know what else
marijuana,
this reminds me of?
open the market up, and let companies, private investors come in and produce these drugs in a regulated environment so that whatever's getting out there on the market is it's safe to the extent that it's not contaminated, it's measured, etc. I absolutely see that
As
that's
we
what's
all
coming
know
down
how
the
well,
road.
well, we all know how well that worked with marijuana, but there's something else I want to point out. This sounds very much like when they switched from global warming to climate change, because what they were doing to begin with, and look, Joseph, I am convinced that the whole thing, climate change and global warming, was all a training ground to get us ready for COVID and to buy into this idea that science is the new God, and that if you go buck the science, then you are committing heresy.
Mortal sin?
And now, absolutely, completely. So now, whenever anybody stands up and says, "Oh, well, the scientists are saying this, but common sense says that," well, they must know better.
Well, the
And now it's
problem,
pouring over into all kinds of areas.
yeah, but the problem, Nick, is I do believe in science. The problem is that we're not getting authentic science anymore.
No, it's the
Um,
junk
I, I
science
like
they're
to
trying to sell us.
I like to point out that for instance, part of my what I call my campaign against euphemisms, we have in Canada. This is for the benefit of our international listeners. Medical assistance in dying,
Yeah,
MAID, which is
right.
MAID. And so the idea, and I go, and I've been saying to people, no, there's no such thing as medical assistance in dying because medicine, the profession of medicine, is about helping people and healing them, not helping them die. So so what happens is you get these people running around wearing lab coats, or they happen to be doctors, or they happen to be working in the medical field generally, And my argument
Right.
is, just because it's a doctor that gives you the injection doesn't make it medical. And it's the same thing. Just because it happens to be somebody with a lab coat that says, that this is what the science says, doesn't necessarily make it science. We have completely, completely forgotten what science is and what the scientific method is. And the very first thing that you learn if you're a real scientist, first of all, scientists used to, I don't know whether they do or not, but it used to be you had to take a compulsory course in what's called epistemology, which is the nature of knowledge. The very first thing you understand about science is that science is based on statistics, and statistics don't prove anything conclusively. Okay, so you cannot say that the science is settled. Science, by definition, is never settled. Okay, science may support a particular theory, and I'm only scratching the surface of what's wrong with people talking about science. Nick, let's go for a quick break. I got that clip, by the way, so we'll play it when we come back.
Excellent. People need to see it.
Okay, so I haven't seen it yet, ladies and gentlemen. So we'll be back in a couple of minutes here on the Nick and Joe Show. Stay tuned.
Ice cream. Give me ice cream with whipped cream. Ice cream. Give me ice cream with whipped cream. Ice cream. A million flavors, let's just do it. Tie me up with ice cream. Sunny days need that cold hit. Ice cream. A million flavors, let's just do it. Tie me up with ice cream. Sunny days need that cold hit. That strawberry chocolate taste. Ice cool vanilla for me. Hundreds and thousands. I need an ice cream island. Give me ice cream with whipped cream. Strawberry sauce. And see my face gleam. I need a wafer on top. Just ice cream full stop. So take me to the pudding shop. Ice cream. A million flavors, let's just do it. Tie me up with ice cream. Sunny days need that cold hit. Ice cream. A million flavors, let's just do it. Tie me up with ice cream. Sunny days need that cold hit. That strawberry chocolate taste.
There is just a feeling that this might be right for us, for you and me. There is just a look, I think this might be right for us, for you and me. There is just a feeling that this might be right for us, for you and me. There is just a look, I think this might.
All right, we are back. And
All
I
right.
haven't got that clip loaded up yet, Nick, so we're going to have to just hold off on it. We're going to play it for sure, but you're going to have to bear with me for a minute here while I
right,
find it in
no
my
problem.
download file.
Well, it's an interesting clip from the point of view, from a parliamentarian process point of view. One side looks calm, cool, collected, and just asking a question, and the other one just loses their mind, and you can figure out pretty quickly which one's which. And this, one of the topics we want to get into tonight, I won't get into it now, but how well or how poorly the different, the two main leaders in the House are doing in the polls. Now, polls, as Diefenbaker would say, are for dogs, but at the same time, they do provide a snapshot on that particular day of what people's attitudes are. And the poll that we'll be referring to I don't want to get into the numbers yet, but it was done by Abacus Research and covered 2,500 people, which for a political poll in Canada is a big slice. I've seen much smaller polls, well under 1,000, usually about somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500 is your average poll. So it'll be a very interesting conversation to have, based on two leadership styles we see.
Yeah, I want to go back for a moment, Nick, while the clip is just
Loading.
uploading into the system here. So we'll play it in a couple of minutes, but I want to go back to the whole thing. I think we touched really just before the break, touching on the nature of science and
Yeah,
the fact that people have become so incredibly addicted to the idea that science is this settled thing altogether. And I dare I point out that, first of all, there's so many things in so-called science that we don't understand. Let me give you probably the best example is this: gravity. We absolutely know that we know there's such a thing as gravity. We know how it
right.
works. But uh, nobody understood that there was a relationship between gravity and light until Einstein came and demonstrated that. Before that, the settled science was that there was no such a thing as a relationship between gravity and light and time. But here's the thing about gravity: we don't know what it is. We absolutely don't know what gravity is. We can observe how gravity works, but here the thing you have to understand about the scientific method is this: if you can design an experiment to test the theory of gravity, and you can run that same experiment a million times and have the same result, but if you have it once, just once, that you don't have the same result, then that means that your theory of gravity is wrong. Now, I'm using, but
Yeah,
the
that's the
theory of
Einstein
gravity
clip.
that we have says nothing about what gravity is, because we don't know what gravity is. And some of the best
Well,
physicist
Einstein said
minds
it
out there are
doesn't take.
trying to figure that out, but they still haven't been able to. We just don't know what it is.
Well, Einstein was very famous for saying it doesn't take a consensus to defeat one of my theories. It takes one fact, and so in other words, consensus has no place in science
No.
because, as you point out, that's not how science is done. And yet, even I have family members who should know better, who have told me, no, global warming, it's a fact. The science is settled. And I looked at the
This,
individual. I don't want to name the individual because I'm not here to embarrass anybody, but of all the people I know in my family, that individual should have known better than to say that, because that is not the scientific method. That is not the way science is designed. If that was the case, we'd still think the Earth was the center of the universe.
well, you cannot. The thing about global warming, about climate change, Nick, is that there is no testable theory around it. Which is, again, when people talk about science, okay, there is a scientific method, and one of the key components of the scientific method is that you have to be able to test your theory through experimentation, and
Right.
nobody has any kind of experimentation to test the validity of of all of the claims around climate change. Now, this does not mean that the climate isn't changing. It also doesn't mean that human beings are not the cause of climate change. Okay, I'm not
We just
making
don't
that
know.
argument right now with respect to this. I'm merely pointing out that there is no plausible scientific um, uh, explanation that is testable in order to demonstrate the validity of the theory. It hasn't been done, and there are so many variables you can't control for the variables in this case. So
which is
so
part of the scientific method.
which of course. And here's the other thing, okay? When you design an experiment, the experiment has to be replicable, which means other people have to be able to do the same experiment with the same results.
Replicatable, yes.
Okay. Now and when you design your experiment, you don't design an experiment to prove that you're right. You design an experiment to try to disprove the theory.
Yeah, that's
Because
the whole point. If you can't, then there's obviously some validity to your argument.
well, the proper way that you express it is not that my experiment proves your experiment can disprove the theory, but it can't prove the theory. It can only support the theory.
Okay,
So
that's fair. Yeah.
so and why is that? Because as I used the example with, if I stand on the planet Earth and I drop a hammer 1,000,000 times, that hammer is going to fall down to the ground. If it doesn't fall down just once, that disproves the theory of gravity that we've been using. Okay. So the very fact that we've done it 1,000,000 times and we haven't had that happen doesn't prove the theory. It supports the theory. It could support the theory in a positive sense because the negative, okay, would disprove the theory. That's the way it works. So there's no such thing as settled science. Okay, it doesn't exist. And the people out there that use that phraseology they're not being accurate. And it's very distressing to me that people out there who otherwise are representing themselves as scientists use that kind of terminology, and it gives a very wrong impression as to what exactly science is. One more point, and then I'm going to play this clip because I have it uploaded now, Nick,
right.
and that is that science. There are many, many things in the world that science doesn't have a say in. Take, for instance, Shakespeare's plays. Okay, who says Shakespeare's plays are great plays? Who says that one movie is better than another movie? Okay, there are many things that science has nothing to do with.
Take
Okay,
religion.
and so science is just one of those things that informs what we do. And even if we are very confident in the validity of a particular scientific theory, that doesn't mean that science is not a dictator. We could still say, notwithstanding what the science says about this, we're not going to do it because we think it's the wrong thing to do. And we may suffer consequences for it, but we may be prepared to suffer consequences for it. Okay? There are lots of times when we basically say, all right, and here's the best example of this, I think, is the family. Okay? Guys would be going around having sex with tree stumps, somebody once put it to me. Okay? Except that we have this thing called the family. And there's a strong social benefit to it, to people exercising self-discipline. There's no science that says that we have to behave this way. The science is just the biology. It's what you do with it, okay? And so people who say we have to do this because the science says that, you don't have to do anything because the science says it. You use your head. That's what part and parcel of what being a human being is. Anyway, enough ranting and raving, Nick. Let's I have not seen this clip.
All
So
right.
we're gonna
Well,
play
I'm
it?
going to just, yep.
Okay, you set it up and then we'll play it.
Okay. This is an exchange between the leader of the King's official opposition, Pierre Poilievre, and the Minister for Mental Health.
Carolyn Bennett.
Yeah, Carolyn Bennett. That's it. I was trying to think of her name. And Pierre simply asks a simple question, a very pointed question, but that's his style. and she loses it. That's the only way to put it. So go ahead and roll it.
Okay, here we go.
Inflation has sent food, housing, and gas prices soaring, but there's one substance that has gone down in price by 90%. Powerful opioids. After the Prime Minister announced 100 million.
I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt the Honourable Leader of the Opposition. Can you start from the top? We're just getting some distractions from all over. From the top, please. Order.
While the Prime Minister has sent inflation for gas, heat, and groceries soaring, there is one product that's actually come down in price. Powerful opioids. The Prime Minister has spent $100 million on so-called safe supply. One Global News reporter went into the street to find out where all these drugs are going. Turns out they're being resold to other addicts in order to raise the money to buy deadly fentanyl. Will the Prime Minister cancel the dollars for drugs and instead put the resources into treatment for addicts?
The Honourable Minister for Mental Health.
Mr. Speaker, we are pretty fed up with this fight against evidence-based programs that actually are saving lives. We cannot allow the Conservatives to take us back to the failed ideology of the past. Even Harper's advisor, Ben Perrin, thinks they're speaking nonsense. So just stop it and save lives.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Speaker.
Order. Order. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
No common sense. The evidence is seen in the tragic faces of addicts who lie overdosed on the pavement in the downtown east side of Vancouver, where after this Prime Minister spent $100 million handing out free drugs to addicts, he has led to a 300% increase in overdoses. Will he stop giving dollars for drugs and instead follow my common sense plan to put the resources into treatment and recovery to bring our loved ones home drug-free?
The Honourable Minister. Order. Order. The Honourable Minister.
People are dying. Save.
One second. Order. 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 One person at a time in this chamber, please. The Honourable Minister.
46,000 overdoses have been reversed in safe consumption sites. That member says that he will stop that. I want him to speak to the parents of the people that would have been lost if there weren't safe consumption sites and safer supply. This is ridiculous.
People are dying because the policies of this Prime Minister are killing them. His policies are flooding the streets with drugs that now go for $1 a hit. You can buy 26 hits of hydromorphine, which is an analog to heroin, for $30, Mr. Speaker. These are drugs paid for by Canadian tax dollars under a program by this government that has led to a 300% increase in drug overdose deaths. Why won't they get some common sense, end dollars for drugs, and put our people in treatment?
The Honourable Minister for Mental Health. Order. Order. The Honourable Minister for Mental Health.
People have to stay alive long enough to get treatment. People are dying because of a toxic drug supply. Safe supply allows people to stay alive long enough. It means that in the CMAJ study just yet...
Order. Please start from the top, the same courtesy I gave to the opposition leader.
People have to stay alive long enough to get to treatment. People are dying because of the toxic, tainted drug supply. When people are on safe supply, the CMAJ article yesterday talked about less drug use, less overdoses, less petty crime. This is an evidence-based project and program that it meets the test of evidence and science, not a journalist who only will speak to the people who disagree with him.
Well, oh, there's so much there to unpack, Nick.
I know.
haven't seen
That's why I
I
wanted
haven't
to.
seen this particular study, the CMA, Canadian Medical Association study, but again, I'm fairly familiar with a number of the studies in support of the safe injection sites, and look, the fact is that I don't think that the facts are really in dispute. Well, maybe they are. The truth is that more and more people are using these drugs. Want to call them toxic, unregulated toxic substances, whatever term you want to use. And Poilievre is right. They're using them because the prices come down on them. And the prices come down largely, not exclusively, but largely because the government has not or has implemented programs that have the result has been that the prices come down, and that has caused an increase, or it's correlated strongly to an increase in the number of people who are using the substances. All of that may be true, and there is some culpability here on the part of the federal government. But again, this is when we talk about evidence-based policy. Scientific evidence is important, an important consideration in formulating any policy, but it is not a dictator. And we as a society can be opposed in principle to the idea that we are going to support people's drug habits, and as a consequence of supporting those drug habits, encourage them. And there's a form of, people don't talk about this. When people are addicted to drugs, it's a kind of an enslavement. And so we are perfectly justified as a society to say, even if the minister is correct, and I don't believe that she is, not for a second, I don't believe that the evidence supports what I think that they're cherry picking evidence, and I know some of the studies that argue that these policies save lives, and they may save lives if you look at things individually. And she's not wrong when she says, if we didn't have these safe injection sites, these people would have died. That's a very real possibility, maybe even a probability. But balanced against that, the lives that are saved, one has to ask how many lives have been destroyed because of the encouragement of drug use, inadvertent though it may be. So it's a very complicated situation. But the bottom line is this: we should not be dictated to by whatever evidence there is. We need to take the evidence into account. But at the final analysis, okay, we have the right as a society, and indeed, I would argue the duty as a society, to say, notwithstanding that evidence, we are going to do this and this because we believe that it's better for the individuals collectively and it's better for society in general. And one example of an idea that's been floated out there that very few people it appeals to, because it involves mandatory incarceration of people who are addicted. Okay, when somebody's collapsing in the street, all right, there should be some sort of a mandatory mandatory institutionalization, a special type of hospital that you put them in, that
We used to
they
have
get
that, did we
mandatory
not?
treatment. Now
Didn't
the
we used to
argument
have
against
that?
sorry.
Isn't that what Cedar Springs and Burt's Rapids were all about?
Well, no, because nobody goes to jail for it. This is the other
No,
thing,
no, but
Nick.
my point is, it doesn't matter whether it's jail. They need to be gotten off the street and forced to take treatment.
But nobody,
Whether
nobody, but that never happens. That never happens. It never
no,
happens.
but it used to is what I'm saying.
Yeah, sure, it used to, but
And we need
nowadays
to
it
bring that
never
policy
happens.
back
So
because
you
who
can.
wants to see some poor guy laying on the street in downtown anywhere?
Well, this is the
You
point.
know. So
This,
I guess I'm absolutely agreeing with you. Bring back that old policy. Um,
but
I won't bother to get into who canceled it. That's ancient history. You can look it up if you want to. But the bottom line is the way it is now is far worse than picking somebody off the street, putting them in an institution, and making sure they take the medicine and the treatment necessary. Give them the treatment they need so
right.
they don't freeze to death or die on the streets of our cities.
Well, this is my argument, okay? And this is a big project. Don't get me wrong. And this is just spitballing it right now. Okay, nobody's actually sat down and worked out what a policy like this would look like, how much it would cost, or anything. But just sort of the 30,000-foot view. Okay,
Right.
is that first of all, drug possession and use ought to remain a criminal offense. People ought to be arrested and prosecuted, and you could have a special drug court if you want, okay, where they're incarcerated then, but not in a regular jail type of thing. It's not that they're being punished, it's that they're undergoing mandatory treatment. And they do that for a week, for 2 weeks, for a month, or whatever. They get clean, they come out, and they're clean, and they have a chance. Now, they may not stay sober, but you're going to probably have a high rate of recidivism. But the point is, you're giving some people a chance that they're
Yeah.
not getting right now. Okay, there are people out there that are going to get clean and sober when they're forced to get treatment. Okay,
Right.
I understand the argument. Treatment doesn't take if they don't want treatment, if they're not willing to have it. But
Yeah.
there's no evidence to support that in the global sense that it's applied. There are people that are addicted out there that once they get clean for a while, that they're going to be better off and they're not going to go back to the drugs. How about arguing about saving them? And then if you go through the program, you get clean and sober, you stay clean and sober for a period of time, you go back to the drug court, okay, with the evidence, have some drug tests, I've got a job, I've got whatever the criteria is, and you have that criminal record expunged, not pardoned, wiped out, expunged totally. And that's the incentive. It's not going to save everybody, but it's going to save
What
the
the
people who
law
want the treatment, and it's going to save a certain percentage of people who don't want the treatment but will benefit from it. And for those that
what
are
we
not going to, there's nothing you're going to do for them anyway. So they'll keep coming back and not back and down. But
But even if let's say that of 1,000 people it saved 10, okay, or 100 people it saved 1, isn't that worth it? Isn't that life valuable, even as messed up as it is, to help them get back on their feet and become productive citizens? I mean,
all,
we've lost this sense of compassion.
all I know, all I could tell you for sure, Nick, is this, okay? And having dealt with in my own family with addictions and the petty crime that goes around addictions, etc. Okay, I can tell you, I cannot imagine that there's a single parent out there, a single brother, a single son or daughter, or sister that would say if anybody, if one of their family members was on drugs and was suffering from it, and the rest of the family suffering too. This is something we never talk about.
Yeah,
okay,
the damage
is
is
the
the family.
collateral damage,
Yeah,
which a policy of providing safe drugs perpetuates that collateral damage. Okay, there isn't a single person that I know who's in that situation who would say to the addict, "Come on, let's go to the safe injection site."
because
It's not a
you can't
solution.
help an alcoholic by giving them a clean glass.
It's not a solution. It's a I'm not underestimating,
Overstating.
underrating the difficulty, the complexity, etc. But Carolyn Bennett is absolutely cherry picking the data.
Yeah,
Why? Because they don't want to force people into any kind of a treatment thing. This is the liberal mindset. It's all about choice. I choose, I choose, I choose. Let's embrace those choices, even though it's the damage. Forget about society again. The forgotten people in the whole drug debate aren't even the addicts, Nick. They're the people who suffer the collateral damage, the broken
yeah,
homes, the broken finances.
yeah. The
It's
kids with their
devastating
parents
to
and so on.
families.
Yeah, yeah. You're absolutely right, Joseph. We do need to take a break. We're a little
You bet.
over, but we'll take a break and we'll be right back on the Nick and Joe Show with more right after this.
And we are back. Welcome.
We
You
are
are.
indeed.
You are tuned into the Nick and Joe Show for Memorial Day weekend or Victoria Day weekend, depending on whether you're at the north of the America-US border, US-Canada border, I should say, or to the south.
You realize we're almost coast to coast?
No, we're nowhere near. You've already turned into a typical Westerner, right? You Easterners,
Well,
you
doesn't
Easterners.
Canada end at
No,
Manitoba border?
I'm not. We're in Ontario. We are not Easterners. We're in central Canada.
I thought that
There's
was
another
Manitoba.
1,000 miles to the east here, Nick,
Well,
as
I'm
you very well
2,500
know.
miles.
Yeah.
Yes, I have actually been now on both coasts.
Yeah.
I've lived on
And
both coasts.
now we got to get you up north.
Only during the summertime.
Absolutely.
Okay. Yeah, because that's different again. I've lived where it's cold, and you know what? I don't mind living in the tropical paradise known as southern BC. It has its advantages. Uh, we met we met some folks from New Zealand at a campground we were staying at, and there was there was 2 or 3 young people who had traveled. The one gentleman was a captain for the super yachts. His super yacht was over 300 feet long, and he was in charge of getting it from point A to point B. And I thought, wow, what a career that must have been. A couple of young ladies with him, and they were all excited about coming to see Canada because New Zealand and Canada are very similar in a lot of ways. So they felt quite comfortable here, and it was really kind of cool to get to know them a little bit. We didn't get a chance to, exchange Christmas card lists or anything, but we certainly did get a chance to meet them and talk to them a little bit about life in both countries, and it was a lot of fun. I don't know why I bothered to bring that up, but there you go.
Why not?
Speaking of things, let's speak of things that actually matter. I was reading that you mentioned in the pre-show warm-up, the pre-production meeting. That's the phrase I'm looking for, about what's going on in Ukraine. And I've got something that's parallel to that. Well, plays into that whole Ukraine mess. But I'll let you take the lead on the Ukraine story because you had a very interesting observation about it. I want people to hear.
Well, it's not earth shattering, and
No,
it's
but
not
it's a good point.
it's not it's probably something that people haven't observed. There are a few things. Okay, I've been paying closer attention to the whole Ukraine news cycle this week, and a couple of things really struck me. The first that really struck me was how incredibly how much of a globetrotter Zelensky has become. It's like there are days when there's news of him surprisingly visiting 2-3 different countries. So he's getting a lot of attention going around, just meeting with leaders from all of the different countries, etc. He was in France and in Germany and all this, and I just it's not a big deal. I'm just saying that I just notice how much time he's spending outside of the country. And a lot of people are going to go, well, of course, he's rallying support for his country in the war against the Russians. Okay, fair enough. But the other thing that I noticed this week, and it recently, just today, I think I saw this story again of how he has this tendency of announcing the support that other countries are giving to the Ukraine before we even hear about it in our own countries. And so I saw that today, he was making some comments about how he's reached an agreement with the Canadian government to get whatever it is he's going to get from the Canadian government. And I'm going, like, we haven't even had a chance. We don't even know about this and haven't had a chance to talk about it here in this country. So, and if you look, it's kind of like a pattern. This is something that's going on a lot. And I don't know if it was me, and to a certain extent it is me. I'm a little irritated by that. I'm going, okay, maybe I don't want you to announce this publicly. Maybe if we're going to provide you with some sort of covert military support, maybe we want it to remain covert. Maybe we don't want the public or the Russians to know about this. So there's I get the feeling that I don't want to say we're being played, but I've just got this thing in the back of my mind, Nick, that's going, it's too much. There's something that just doesn't smell right here. Um, and again, I'm not putting down Ukraine. I'm not saying defending the Russians. I'm not doing any of that stuff. But I'm not really sure I can put my finger on it. But there's something about this guy, and there's something about the way he's conducting his relations with other countries like Canada that is, there's a little, unlike when we were talking about, seeing that terminology, unregulated toxic drugs, in the and we just lost Nick here for a few minutes, so I'm sure he's going to log back in. But unlike when we were talking about that term, setting off all kinds of alarm bells and whistles and lights and flags and stuff like that, I can't say that it's the same thing here. What I can say is that it's triggered a little bit of an alarm bell. Not a big one, but a little one anyway. So I'm not entirely sure. I'm not entirely sure why it's doing that. And Nick, of course, is back with us. We just lost him for a minute. And Nick, you should have heard me. I was just so eloquent.
Well, listen,
Nick, I'm sorry I have to interrupt you, Nick, but the quality of your connection is really poor right now. So we're just getting some jumble. I'm not really sure why it is, but you may want to maybe just disconnect and reconnect again to see if we could get a better connection. Okay. So while Nick is doing that, why don't we, where are we here? Going back again to to what we're talking about, or what I'm mentioning about the situation in the Ukraine. And again, I don't know what it is. There's something that's not quite kosher in this whole way that this thing is being handled. And it's not just because that the President Zelensky has this bad habit that's developed, that yeah, I see a Nick there. I think that's probably better. I still see there's a little bit of
okay.
caution here about the connection strength. Are you using the Elon Musk system?
No, I'm not.
Yeah, it's not coming. It's not coming through very well there, Nick. I don't know why, but for some reason your Wi-Fi is not working very well right now.
Well,
Anyway,
see if that makes.
Well, I'm going to let you fool around with that for a few minutes, Nick. And I am watching monitoring it here, so I'll see when things sort of get a little better. Your internet strength, according to this, is 6 out of 10, and mine, of course, is 10 out of 10. But it's nothing to brag about. I have no control over that, Nick. Anyway, so as I'm saying, I'm not entirely sure what the issue is with this, but I don't think this is the proper way to conduct international affairs, where you're just out there running around. And I think we got Nick back here. Looks a lot better now. All of a sudden, there, Nick.
I think my cell phone was too far away.
Okay, so that could be it. All I know is that you are now a 9 out of 10.
Well, nobody's a 10 out of 10.
Well, that's not true. I'm a 10 out of 10.
Not in the looks department, buddy.
Well, no, on the strength
Neither
of my
one of us
signal
did.
here, on the strength of my
Oh,
signal.
okay. Anyway, the what I wanted to say about that, you were talking about Zelensky and how there's a lot of uneasiness about the way he's handling himself. I've been saying that all along, that there's something greasy about this guy. Something bothers me about him and about the way that he goes about doing this. Like, look, when he first came on the scene, he was in combats, he was with his troops, he was, you know, being the glorious leader at the front and taking the same risks as his soldiers, and the whole world just fell in love with him. And that always bothered me for several reasons. For one thing, that died out back in the Middle Ages. The idea that kings lead from the front. They don't do that and haven't done that for centuries. Uh, it's like pick anywhere you want to. The generals are always well back, so they have a much better overview of the battlefield. So what's he doing up front? So that was a little red flag for me. The other one was Ukraine was never a democracy, and people have always like Churchill. No, he's not even close. You know, there's no comparison between Churchill and Zelensky. Zelensky is not even a very good orator. He's just really good at manipulating people to give him money. The third thing, more recently, that bothers me about this announcement he's making on our behalf without coming through Parliament and debating it, he says we have a new deal, a new military deal with Ukraine. What more do we have to give them? We are already, look, even before all this, we were way below where we should be from a military point of view. Trudeau's admitted we're never going to meet our 2% of GDP on defense target, and yet he's giving away the whole store to Ukraine. What more have we got to give him? We've sent Leopard tanks over, we've sent artillery over, we've sent God knows how much ammunition over. We've got special trainers on the ground to help these Polish and Ukrainian soldiers learn how to use the Leopard and all that stuff. We've got troops in Latvia. It's crazy. I don't know what more we can do for the guy. And yet, you know, is he looking for just cold hard cash? And God knows there's very little of that around. If you look at our bank account recently, we're well over $1 trillion in debt now. And he's giving away everything that our military needs, just never mind fighting a foreign war, just to help defend the country and fulfill our role in NORAD, never mind NATO.
Well,
Now,
how about, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, so on top of that, you have this nonsense about making Ukraine part of NATO. Now there's another story out where Finland and Sweden want to become part of NATO.
And
Now,
they are. They've already been approved. They're
yeah,
in.
okay. So if you look at the logic and you put yourself on the Russian side of the line, okay, and this is something I don't think our world leaders either don't understand or don't care about. You know, what do they want in Russia? Are you going to go through regime change and have a power vacuum by getting rid of Putin? If that's the case, by calling him a war criminal before the war's over, you're going to do that with a guy with his finger on the nuclear trigger and say, okay, well, if I'm going to end up dead anyway, what difference does it make to me if I pull that trigger or not? You're just escalating everything by, instead of saying no to countries like Finland and Ukraine to join NATO, to allow for those buffer countries between the Russians and NATO. This is nonsense. This is, from a strategic point of view, this is absolutely insane. This is how wars escalate and people die. I watched that CNN town hall with Trump a few weeks ago, and I know it's older news, but he had a comment in it when they asked him about, does he want Ukraine to win? He said, I just want the Ukrainians and the Russians to stop dying. And this is not how you go about that.
Yeah. Well, just circling back to your comment about not having the resources to be able to fulfill our commitments, our current NATO commitments and NORAD commitments as well. And what I was going to add to that was set those aside for a minute, how about our commitment right here, our domestic commitments, where we've been mobilizing the military to help fight wildfires in BC
In
and
Alberta.
in northern Alberta? So, it's not just about fighting enemies outside. The fact is that when you join the military, you have a whole range of responsibilities that the armed forces in this country takes on, not just the responsibility to fight and defend the country or to fight and defend other countries under the principle of collective security. But
Right.
we've talked about this before, Nick, and I think we're pretty much aligned on this as well. Is that the NATO is supposed to be a defensive alliance, and you can't expect. And when Ukraine became independent in the early 1990s, there were agreements that were made and understandings that were arrived at that it would be a neutral buffer country between the East and the West.
Right.
And so the idea, I think that it would have been beneficial if when we knew this was going to be a problem, because it wasn't just that the Ukraine wanted to join NATO. There was a context to that request, that desire in the first place. And that context was that there was an ongoing fighting between Russians and Ukrainians in border areas where there was tremendous ethnic, linguistic mixing
Mhm.
for historical reasons. And so, when Ron DeSantis, who was, by the way, I think unjustly criticized for saying this, because I think he was right when he pointed out, look, at the very basic level, what's going on between the Ukraine and Russia, at least originally, was nothing more than a border dispute,
That's right.
and which escalated not in small part due to the decision to entertain the possibility that Ukraine was going to join NATO. When you think about that, and again, let me be very clear, I am not defending what the Russians have done here. I'm just saying that I can kind of understand the thinking, I think, that goes into this. Here we're in the middle of a border dispute with the Ukrainian government over a territory. Remember, Ukraine was not an independent country. The Ukraine was a province within the Soviet Union. And I pointed out on my show the other day when we were having a discussion around this that, Nikita Khrushchev, for instance, was not Russian. He was
He's
Ukrainian.
That's right.
And interestingly enough, Stalin was not Russian
Was
either.
Ukrainian as well.
No, he wasn't Ukrainian. He was
Oh,
Georgian,
Georgian. That's right. Georgian. Yes.
from the country of Georgia, not the U.S. state of Georgia.
No.
Okay. So this is the way that the Soviet Union was. And while there were administrative lines that were drawn between the Russian Federation and the Ukrainian Federation as part of the Soviet Union, it's important to understand that that line was not, it didn't separate Ukrainians from Russians. In fact, along those border lines, there was a lot of mix. And so there were a lot of Russians who found themselves on the Ukrainian side of a border that they didn't want to be on. And there were a lot of Ukrainians, frankly, who didn't want to be on the Russian side of the border. But rather than moving, they've been arguing about this border for years. And there's been outbreaks of violence and conflict around them. And a lot of this spilled over into Ukraine, at which point in time, as we all know, the Russians basically said, well, we're going to go and take over the Ukraine and annex it. Why? Because we still have the same border dispute, but this is very strategically important to us, the Russians, in terms of our control of the Black Sea, etc., and that area of the world. Okay, so in that context, now you introduce, while all of this is going on, the possibility that we're going to let them come into NATO. The answer to that is no. You have a years long on again, on, off again, low level warfare with Russia. And what is the implication for the rest of countries like Canada and the United States if we allow Ukraine to become part of NATO under those circumstances? Well, what happens if the Russians happen to do what they've done now, and that is a full scale invasion, or maybe just a so called border incursion, where all of a sudden our treaty obligations are invoked in order to defend the Ukraine? So you could very easily see how this would provoke the Russians.
Well, that was
Okay.
my yeah.
I know that's your
I
point,
mean,
and
yeah.
I'm agreeing with you. I'm just sort of elaborating on it a little bit.
Yeah, and
It's
that's fine. I think you and I have been on the same page for a while on this, but like even the idea of Finland and Sweden being added to the mix, Finland fought a long bloody war during World War II against the Russians
right.
and handed the Russians their backsides in their steel helmets. I
Well,
mean,
people don't realize, Nick, that Finland was an ally of Germany, and at the same time that the Germans invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, so did the Finns. They fought two wars against the Russians. The first was a Russian invasion, actually, that the Finns were able to beat back
that's
in
right.
1940,
Yep.
but then they became allies of the Germans, and they invaded the Soviet Union again in 1941. And the
Well, that was
Finns
they
were
did.
a significant contributor to the siege of Leningrad.
Well, the thing to remember now, before people start thinking Finns are Nazis, is that they did it because the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Right.
To use an old saying, it wasn't they had any love for socialism or Nazism.
Right.
It's that they had a threat on their border that the guy that was fighting, the Germans were fighting, and they wanted to
Right.
help eliminate that threat. So
Right. Right.
it was more a marriage of convenience than it was of any kind of
Agreed.
love interest between the two.
Yeah,
So I just want to make that point
I
so
agree
people
with you.
don't.
I think you're quite right about that.
Yeah, and like today in Finland, that they have a very capable military. They're one of the most well equipped armies certainly in Europe, if not in the world, and they are more than capable of defending themselves. So their mission to NATO, other than to be used by NATO in some kind of war, I don't
Well,
see the advantage from either side here.
well, I don't. If again, it's easy for us to say we're the
Yeah,
armchair
we're 10
diplomats
dozen
here,
miles.
right? But
Yeah, absolutely.
but if it was me, I would have. I was not a supporter of Finland or Sweden becoming part of NATO for two
Right.
reasons. The first is that I honestly don't see the Russians threatening threatening Finland. I don't see I don't see an invasion. So I don't see what's going on in Ukraine as wrong as what the Russians are doing. I don't see it as part of an expansionist policy. In other words, I don't see that the Russians want to take over all of Ukraine in order to reestablish the old Soviet Union.
Yeah.
I see that the invasion of the Ukraine and everything that the Russians have been doing as being a response and part and parcel of an escalation of what was essentially a border conflict between the two countries. I don't see Finland or Sweden being threatened by the Russians. I don't see the Russians invading Finland. Okay, we're going to conquer Ukraine, and the next is we're going to conquer Finland. Therefore, Finland's got to become a member of NATO because that way it'll deter the Russians from invading Finland. I
Yeah,
just
I
don't see
agree
it.
with you there too. And it just deepens the mystery. Like, what's the point if there's no real threat? Because Russia doesn't need natural resources. They're not going in after oil like the Germans did in 1940. They're not going after steel. They're not going after raw materials. They have everything in Russia that they need. They need to put a system in place that's not nearly as corrupt as the one that's there to take advantage of those things, but they have all the advantages. They're the world's biggest country. If they don't have it, you don't need it, is pretty much the way that they should look at it. I mean, what don't they have? I mean, they've got gold mines, silver mines, lumber, you name it. Every raw material you can think of is present in Russia. So what's the point of taking on a war over a country like Finland, who has its own mineral deposits and all that, but the fallout from it would be far worse than anything you could gain.
Yeah, and ultimately, there's nothing stopping us as NATO countries from coming to the aid of Finland in a very real
If
military
it ever did
sense,
happen, yeah.
in exactly the same way that we would do it under a treaty obligation.
Or we're
Just
doing it
because
with Ukraine.
the only difference is, well, the only difference is that we wouldn't be doing it out of obligation. We'd be doing it out of a matter of a conscious decision that would be our policy. But not
Right.
being part of NATO doesn't preclude us from coming to the defense of other countries. So again, I don't agree with the rationale. But here's the thing, Nick, and we have to go for a break. But let me
Yeah.
just point out that the quality of the thinking that goes on in the highest levels of government these days on issues like this is not. It's severely deteriorated. We have a lot of people in key decision-making areas that don't think things through very well, don't know the history very well, don't understand they don't care about the details.
Consequences.
It's like they pursue cliches. I saw Lindsey Graham in the States this past week in some congressional hearings, and I have a lot of time for Lindsey Graham. Don't get me wrong; I like the man. I very much agree with him on many things. But when he talks about how if we had to get involved in Ukraine, because if we didn't stop the Russians in Ukraine, they'd be causing trouble somewhere else. I don't know. I that to me is a little cliche. It's a little bit like, okay, Lindsey, you're citing Cold War strategy, and it was very effective at that time and very necessary. But I don't think it applies in this case. So,
Yeah.
but it sounds good. It's the same thing with appeasement, Nick. I don't know if here's a chance for me to give a plug before the break for my website, josephbenamy.com, all one word without the hyphen. But I posted a column there this week, and it kind of goes around. The title of the column is, and it's aimed particularly at conservatives, okay, is thou shalt not bear false witness against your neighbors, even if they're liberals.
Yeah, I saw that.
Okay, so but there's another one there just before that really goes into detail, and somebody had sent this email around where they were quoting Churchill on appeasement, but they misquoted him. Churchill was not against appeasement; he was just against appeasement applied in the wrong place. Churchill was very clear and said in 1950 that appeasement has a place in all policy. You just have to apply it correctly. So people talk about appeasement and they like to go, well, look what happened to Germany in the 1930s. Again, I'm not defending the Russians, but I am saying that Russia in 2023 is not National Socialist Germany any more than Ukraine is a Nazi country. Okay.
Right. All
Let's
right.
go for a break, and
Let's do that.
we'll be back in a couple of minutes here on the Nick and Joe Show.
All right.
Bouncing around to that lively music.
Yeah, love that stuff. Um, Switching gears here because I think we beat that one to a dry white powder. I wanted to talk a little bit about
An
uh,
unregulated dry white powder, I might add.
as a matter of fact, uh, uh, I've been watching polls as I don't know if I alluded to this before the show in the pre-show warm up, or whether we talked about it on the air at the top of the show. I forget, but
I think you
Diefenbaker
mentioned it
had
already on the air, but let's go on.
okay. Well, Diefenbaker had a great quote: "Polls are for dogs." Oh, I did mention it, so it's time to dig into that. I think I've been watching the. My question to people is, what is it about Pierre Poilievre you don't like? And I'm just looking for honest answers. I'm not trying to say you should like him or shouldn't. I want honest answers. And for the most part, I get responses from liberals who are nebulous at best. They can't seem to come up with anything. So I thought, well, what do the poll numbers really look like? And I went to pull up. There's a piece in the National Post dated. What's the date? May 15th. So it's a few days. It's not yesterday, but Abacus did a poll. It takes in 2,500 people. And here's what let me just read you a couple of paragraphs about it, then we can talk about it. The Abacus data poll conducted May 9th to 12th asked 2,500 respondents from across the country a series of questions about the two leaders. They're talking about, of course, Pierre and JT. Including who represents Canadian values well, who genuinely cares about making Canada better, and whether Trudeau and Poilievre hide their true views to make them more acceptable. Okay, so here's how the numbers break down. 48% of voters agreed Poilievre is a competent leader, compared with just 42% for Trudeau. Just 27% believe Trudeau has good judgment, compared with 45% for Pierre. On kindness, like that matters, the PM scored 58%, Poilievre's 42%, and only 35% of respondents said Trudeau is too extreme, compared to with 44% by Poilievre. Now, one more paragraph. The pair scored about the same when asked whether they represented Canadian values well, 43%, and Trudeau does, and agreed that Trudeau does, and 44% agreed that Pierre does. So Pierre's got him by 1 point there. It's a similar story when the respondents were asked whether each leader genuinely cares about making the country better. Trudeau received 48, Poilievre captured 50. So in a lot of ways, you're neck and neck, but that wasn't always the case. Mr. Poilievre is moving up in the polls. He's becoming more palatable to more people. And I think the longer you see, and this part of the reason why I wanted that clip to play, you see him stand up and stay calm. He doesn't get ruffled. He's acting prime ministerial, the way you want a leader to present himself. And this isn't a plug for Pierre. I'm just comparing apples to apples. When you look at the leadership on one side, and every party does this to a certain degree, they refuse to answer a direct question. You know, never answer the question you're asked, always answer the question you wish they'd asked. And the Liberals have made that an art. And it's true no matter who's in power. So I'm not trying to say the Conservatives never do that. But when you get asked a simple question like, how much does XYZ cost? What's the cost of servicing the debt? And you're talking to the Minister of Finance, and all you get is nebulous answers. People just sit there and go, this is who's running the country. They can't answer a simple question that's actually in the budget. I'm picking a specific example, by the way. So when I look at this, the question I have is, I think that saying that Conservatives need to do more, or we need to go after Liberals, because from my perspective, the sooner we get rid of the current government in Ottawa, the better. But I think our focus is wrong. I think instead of going after the Liberals, we should be going after the NDP. Now, you're not going to change Jagmeet Singh. He's going to do whatever Jagmeet's going to do, whether you like it or not. But amongst his troops over there, there's got to be a few people that are saying, why are we supporting this guy? He won't keep his end of the bargain. He lies like a fish, on a beach. I mean, it's just ridiculous. And if we go after them and start to go after their, as people who are, because out here in BC, believe it or not, there's a lot of hatred for the current government in Ottawa. It's just below the surface. You start talking, all you got to do is mention gas prices, and people's fangs come out and their claws come out, because it's like $1.83 out here, and it's one of the highest gas prices in the country. And people are trying to run businesses, they're trying to feed their families, they're trying to, all kinds of different things going on. So there's the hatred again. So if you scratch a little deeper, they say, well, I'll show him, I'm going to vote NDP. What? Are you not paying attention? It's the NDP. They're keeping him in power. Why would you do that if you hate the man so much? If you hate the party so much? So I think we need, as Conservatives, to focus on our NDP brothers and sisters and make that point. Say, if you really don't like this guy, then you need to not vote for a party that is going to support them. Find someplace else to put your vote. Even if it's not Conservative, vote Green, vote PBC, anything. But don't vote NDP, because it's the NDP that are keeping this guy in power. And it's that deal with the devil they've made that's coming back to haunt us now. So when I looked at those numbers and I thought about what it takes to bring on an election so we can get past this and begin to repair the damage done since 2015 or 2014, whenever they came to power, that's the only answer I'd come up with.
Well, you're pulling me out of a discussion about principle into a discussion about strategy and tactics. So, which is fair. So I'm going to give you the strategic, tactical lay of the land. One of the things, I agree with you about the NDP. The NDP, of course, is propping up the government. Whether there was a formal agreement with the NDP or not, they would continue to prop up the government until such a time as the polling indicates that they're going to do well in a general election. So it's not about where the Conservatives are, and it's not about where the Liberals are. Unless, of course, the Conservatives were way down and the Liberals were way up, in which case the government would find a way to engineer its own defeat and have a general election.
Right.
But the same principle applies to the NDP. The same calculation is made by the New Democrats. And so they're going to hold off. They're going to continue to support this government so long as they believe that going to the polls will be detrimental to their party interests. And that's the calculation. It's callous, but there it is. So, in a sense, when you're saying go after the NDP as opposed to going after the Liberals, well, let's take that at face value and let's assume that the Conservatives start attacking the NDP and the NDP starts to drop in the polling. If the NDP starts to drop in the polling and the Conservatives pick that up, but even if the Conservatives don't pick that up, there's no way the NDP brings down the government.
I guess when I said go after them, I didn't mean an attack. I'm saying talk about explain to them the consequences of the decisions they're making. Like, if you continue, because I hear you, you're in a real world scenario, you're absolutely right about that's how people politicians, the policy makers, the people who chart the course that the party's going to follow think. I get that. And maybe I've got it completely backwards. Maybe we should go out and say, go out there and try to help the NDP become more popular so they don't have to support the Liberals, as much as it sounds anathema to me to say that, because the last thing I want is more socialism. But if it gets rid of the fox in the hen house,
Yeah, see, Nick, this is going to be a very big adjustment for you
it is. I'm having a hard time with it
because
already.
you are living in NDP country. Okay, you've moved from arguably the strongest conservative
Conservative writing, yeah, I know.
riding in the country, or the riding in the country that's represented by the strongest conservative in parliament, to NDP country, and so this was a thing that nobody ever understood about the Reform Party, was that a significant amount of the support that the Reform Party gained in British Columbia in particular was not amongst conservative voters, it was amongst NDP voters. Because the NDP was always considered to be the protest vote in British Columbia. It used to be the Social Credit part, but the Social Credit's been gone for some time now. But the NDP gets the opposition vote, if you will, in British Columbia, and so as a consequence of that, the Reform Party, which was seen largely as a protest party, people flocked to it, including a lot of NDP supporters, and those NDP supporters are left-leaning voters, and so they're not going to vote conservative. And they probably aren't going to vote green. They may vote green, but there's not much of a point of voting green because you're not going to really get any kind of policy substance. Whereas,
you're not going to get anywhere if you have an agenda with the Green Party, that's for sure.
So,
but
you
this
have
shoe doesn't fit very well, Joseph. This shoe doesn't
I
fit
can
very
well
well.
imagine, Nick.
Oh man, because this goes against everything I've been saying for years.
Well, you have to keep saying it. You have to keep saying it, Nick.
The idea of helping the NDP. Oh my God!
What I've discovered now that I enter into, I don't want to call them the sunset years, but the late afternoon years.
We had a conversation with somebody
is that I don't care. I mean, I care on one hand. I'm a political realist, okay, but on the other hand, I believe that we need to have more people like you and me, Nick, and what we're doing, fighting and defending principles as opposed to simply getting involved in political tactics. There's a place for that, don't get me wrong, but I think that one of the problems that we've had in this country in particular, in the conservative movement, is that we've surrendered the leadership of our movement to the political establishment. And the political establishment and I'm not throwing stones at them. I'm just saying that the political party, the Conservative Party, has a particular agenda. And the agenda is to get elected. And sometimes getting elected is not quite perfectly aligned with our desire to push for policy change, to push and to promote certain principles that, for various reasons that are very valid, very legitimate, the political party that represents us may feel that it's not particularly helpful, and not necessarily possible to implement those policies. But notwithstanding that, we have an obligation to continue to cultivate Canadian voters, to continue to promote what we believe is right. And in doing that, what we're doing is we're softening the ground, if you will, for a Conservative Party, making it easier for them to adopt some of the principles and policies that we're proposing, but understanding that in politics, as Ronald Reagan said, and this was again in this column, one of the columns that I wrote this past week, Ronald Reagan said, I'd much rather take half a loaf of bread than no loaf at all. And he pointed out that in the legislative process, no one's ever going to get their way 100% of the time. That's just the nature of the beast. The fact is that as conservatives, and I don't mean that politically, I mean that philosophically, but also politically, we are in a minority in this country. So there's a limited amount of what we can do, given the fact that we live in a democracy. There's a limited amount of what we can do from a policy perspective. All of that is true at the political level. And that is why it's dangerous for movement conservatives to simply cede control or leadership of the movement to the political leaders, because their agenda is different. And if we allow them to be the spokespeople for the conservative movement, then you will see what we see all the time, or quite often in this country anyway, and that is organizations that are not affiliated with the Conservative Party, leaders basically saying, shush, we can't really talk about that right now because we have to get behind the Conservative Party in order to get rid of the Liberals in government. And again, I'm sympathetic to that, but what happens then is that we self-censor, okay? And we tell ourselves, oh, we can't push on that. Okay, well, why can't we push on it? Well, we can't push on it because it's going to undermine the Conservative Party's effort to get elected. And that may be true, okay, but if we're not pushing, then what happens? So these are all things that have to be taken into consideration. Look,
Now,
go ahead.
I was just going to ask you, given what we were just talking about and looking at this poll by advocates, does it really matter how popular the leader of the party is, considering the fact we don't elect leaders, we elect parties, and then the leader of that party becomes the prime minister? Are we too focused on that? And I'm speaking in a general sense, not on the same kind of plane that you're talking about from a conservative, multi-conservative strategy point of view, but just for people who love to look at polls, does it really matter in the long run?
Yeah, I'll tell you what, it does matter, because I don't agree with you entirely. We don't elect. The way the system works is we're supposed to elect our local representative, but we don't elect our local representative. In some cases, we do. I won't say that it doesn't count at all, but what really counts isn't even the political party. That's a major factor, but the real factor is the leadership. We've in our system have reached the point where we're essentially conducting a presidential type of election focused on the leaders, and they're the ones that make or break the election on behalf of their parties, and to a large degree on behalf of the individuals who are running down ticket. Even though there's no such thing as down ticket here in Canada, but you can picture what I mean. So in essence, when people go to the polls, they're going to vote for their local candidate, or the local candidate representing a particular political party, but they're doing it because, for the most part, they want to elect the prime minister. And that's the cold, hard reality that we find ourselves in now. So yeah, popularity does matter. Personal popularity and appeal does matter a great deal these days when it comes to general elections. The popularity and personality of the leaders. And in that respect, there are a lot of good things in this poll, but there are a lot of troubling things as well. And it's funny, when you cited the numbers, Nick, all I could think of was, it's almost, voters out there almost seem to be a little schizophrenic, because on the issues of principle, they seem to be largely behind Pierre.
Yeah.
But then when you get into the question of personality, then they swing back towards Trudeau. Not entirely, but it's a sort of a dichotomous kind of relationship.
Even in that sense, I'm not convinced that the people are as smitten with Trudeau as a lot of media outlets would have you believe, even these polls. I really, when I'm not doing my podcast, I try to keep my political hair tucked up under my hat
That's good.
just because of where I am, right? And we're so new to the area. I don't want to create any enemies any earlier than I have to. So I really kind of take it, but it comes up over and over and over again from all kinds of people how much they cannot tolerate. They are sick to death of the current prime minister. They are embarrassed by him. They're just they can't understand why why he behaves the way he behaves. They just have no interest in seeing him continue. So it's very, very much a. I think that his support is half an inch thick and 5 miles wide. I really getting a note from my assistant here. Yeah, we've seen a lot of those. You know what "Go Brandon" means?
Yes.
Yeah, well, the Canadian version of that. We've seen more of those bumper stickers than lately, and we don't go looking for them. They're just there.
Yeah.
Everything from motorcycles to bicycles to cars to trucks. We see them all over the place. So house windows, yeah, even in people's house windows. One guy had a great big billboard on his front porch. So,
you know what you should do is you should be taking some pictures of those, and send them to me, and we'll post them up somewhere.
All right, maybe I'll do that next time I'm out, and every time I see one, I'll take another picture of it. We'll make a montage. Even the West Coast hates him.
Okay, but the problem, of course, again, is that they're not going to vote Conservative. Well, maybe they will. I don't know. Who knows?
You know what? Based on what you just said, maybe having them vote more NDP would be better.
Well, it would be better. The stronger the NDP is, because the NDP bleeds votes from the Liberals, not the Conservatives.
Yep.
So absolutely.
That is true. So you could have this, and the next thing you know, the blue comes up the outside. There you go. All right. With that having been said, it's pretty much time to wrap this puppy up. My apologies for last week. I have no excuse to offer, but I just flat forgot. We were out on a Mother's Day trip, and I saw the notes later and went, oh no. So anyway,
Nick, we had fun. We had fun with you on my show on Monday night.
That's what I was afraid of. All right. With that said, for Joseph and I want to bid you all a good evening. Have a great Memorial Day weekend or a Victoria Day weekend. Keep it on the right side of the border. And for you American listeners, you certainly hope you have a great Memorial Day. We'll see you all again next week. In the meantime, ubi caritas et amor, Thea CBS. Good evening. God bless. Don't let anything disturb your peace. And may you have a fair wind and a following sea.